Japanese-American Internment made by Khadija Mulwala, Tanisha Reza, and Angeline Matthew. In the shadow of World War I, a dark chapter unfolded in history.
The internment of Japanese Americans was a serious violation of their civil rights driven by fear and prejudice. This documentary explores the harsh realities of this event, the lives it affected, and the lesson it imparts about government accountability and the protection of civil rights.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese Empire thrust the United States into World War II. The wake of this tragedy, fear and suspicion towards Japanese Americans surged, and it was fueled by wartime hysteria and racial prejudice. December 7, 1941, just before 8 a.m., Japan launched a surprise attack on the United States by bombing the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack involved 350 Imperial Japanese aircrafts and lasted about 75 minutes. During the raid, nearly 20 American naval vessels, including 8 battleships and more than 340 airplanes, were destroyed or damaged. Over 2,400 Americans lost their lives and many more were wounded. Although the attack was a surprise, tensions between the U.S. and Japan had been building for years, particularly over Japan's expansion into China. The goal of attacking Pearl Harbor was to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet, giving Japan the opportunity to carry out its plans for control of the Pacific without the U.S.'s interference.
Despite the lack of evidence, Japanese Americans were viewed as potential threats to national security. This unfounded fear led to Executive Order 9066.
Executive Order 9066, authorized by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, forced the relocation and internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were U.S. citizens. Families were uprooted from their homes, businesses were abandoned, and lives were disrupted.
What we're going to be looking at today is Watercolors by Akio Ujihara.
Ujihara was a 44-year-old engineer from Los Angeles. He was also one of many Americans detained during World War II, simply because he was of Japanese descent. The chapter of history these watercolors depict is rarely discussed.
This is just his personal way of remembering what life was like in the camps. This one is from Mansnarm. And these two are from Topaz.
After Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government set up 10 internment camps across the West. They detained over 100,000 Japanese Americans perceived as a threat to the war effort. Half of those detained were children.
You know, it really wasn't that long ago. People that were in these camps, some of them are still alive, and
so many of them.
In fact, Nathan is about to meet one. Betty Tyra was only 8 when her family was sent into the Heart Mountain internment camp in Wyoming.
There were 5 in our family, an older sister, a younger brother, and my parents. And each of us was allowed to take 1 suitcase, but it was too much for my brother and for me. So from a family of 5, we only had 3 suitcases.
Wow.
Every family was issued a number.
There were 6 units in a barrack. They were non-insulated buildings. It wasn't even this big, but it had a window on one side and a window on the other, 1 incandescent light. There was no sink, no bathroom, no stove, but it was just a barren room and 5 cots.
Yeah, what kind of food
did you have?
You know, they tried to cook rice, but it was either too soft or crunchy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And lots of pork and beans. It was not our normal diet.
Betty's family spent nearly a year in the camps.
The internment was a clear violation of civil liberties. The government justified it as a necessary security measure, but it was rooted in racial prejudice and wartime paranoia.
Life for Japanese Americans in internment camps were really difficult. The internees were sent to remote camps, often located in desolate areas with harsh living conditions. They were forced out of their homes and had to live in crowded, uncomfortable barracks with little privacy. The conditions were bad, with poor sanitation and extreme weather. They lost their jobs, homes, and belongings, but they tried to make the best of it by setting up schools and community activities. It was a really unfair and difficult time for them. These camps were surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by armed soldiers.
I grew up here in Los Angeles until Pearl Harbor. And then, as I think you know, Japanese Americans on the West Coast were summarily rounded up and sent into 10 barbed wire internment camps. I was 4 at the time of Pearl Harbor, and I was too young to really understand what was going on. But I still do remember that day when armed soldiers with guns, bayonets on them, came to our home to order us out. I remember that as a very scary day. And you know, a child can sense your parents' anxieties. And we were taken from our home to a horse stable at Santa Anita Racetrack, where we were housed for a few months while the camps were being built. And when the camp was built, we were put on a train and taken all the way across the southwestern desert to the swamps of Arkansas, a camp called Roller. And I grew up there for a portion of the war. And then we were transferred from that camp to another camp in Northern California called Tule Lake, which was an even more harsh camp. There were 3 levels of barbed wire fence and tanks patrolling the perimeter. And after the war, we came back home to Los Angeles.
The internment was challenged in the court, but the Supreme Court upheld the government's action in cases like Korematsu v. United States. It wasn't until decades later that the U.S. government acknowledged its wrongdoing. The Korematsu case was about Fred Korematsu, a Japanese American who didn't follow the order to go to internment camps during World War II. He got arrested and took his case to the Supreme Court, arguing that the order was unfair and based on race. The Supreme Court in 1944 said the order was okay because of wartime. Later, people realized it was wrong and his conviction was canceled in 1983.
In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which formally apologized for the internment and provided reparations to surviving internees.
The legislation that I am about to sign provides for a restitution payment to each of the 60,000 survivors, surviving Japanese Americans, of the 120,000 who were relocated or detained. Yet no payment can make up for those lost years. So what is most important in this bill has less to do with property than with honor. For here we admit a wrong. Here we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law. Thank you all again, and God bless you all. I think this is a fine day.
What happened to you?
We moved to Washington, D.C. I went to junior high school. High school, I graduated from the University of Maryland. You know, this war experience spurred many Japanese Americans. They did so much to prove their loyalty. They went to school and they have become very successful people in all walks of life. So from that disaster, I think that it spurred us to become even better people.
It also spurred us to become a better country. Ultimately, the U.S. government apologized to Japanese American families for the incarceration.
The internment of Japanese Americans is a stark reminder of the dangers of prejudice and fear. It underscores the need for caution in protecting the rights of all citizens and holding the government accountable for its actions.
As we reflect on this dark chapter, let us remember the resilience of those who endured the internment camps and strive to endure that such injustices never happen again. The story of a Japanese American internment is a powerful testament to the enduring struggle for civil rights and the responsibility we all share in safeguarding them.
In memory of those who suffered and persevered,